Good evening. Welcome to this Liberal International British Group webinar, jointly hosted with the Liberal Democrat Overseas regarding the US elections. We look forward to hearing from our speakers this evening, and without further ado, I will hand you over to the chair for this evening's discussion, George Cunningham.
Hi, I'm George Cunningham, Chair of Lib Dems Overseas and moderator of this exciting webinar. Lib Dems Overseas represent UK Liberal Democrat members living outside Europe across 60 countries around the world. We're co-hosting the event with Liberal International British Group, chaired by Adrian Trett. Adrian and I are delighted together to bring this webinar to you. The title of the webinar is US Elections, Has the International Liberal Order Been Saved? Our distinguished panel of speakers are David O'Sullivan, formerly Ambassador of the European Union Delegation to the United States, 2014 to 2019, Dr. Leslie Vinjamuri, Director of the US and the Americas Program at Chatham House, Royal Institute of International Affairs, and Hans van Baalen, President of ALDE, the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats for Europe Party, and President of Honour of Liberal International. And then, of course, there'll be Q&A afterwards, so it'll be over to you. So anyway, to start with, I hotly welcome David O'Sullivan to speak now. Over to you, David.
He will rejoin the World Health Organization, which, whatever its defects, and there are real defects in the World Health Organization, is the only international organization we have which can help us deal not only with this pandemic, but with the whole issue of future pandemics. And I think everyone recognizes that this may be a terrible pandemic, but it possibly is only the first of, certainly in a series that we've already known, but it could be foretelling future pandemics, and we really need an international system which can cope and deal with these things in a much better way than we were able to deal with COVID. He will come back to the table, and I choose my words carefully, on the Iran deal, the joint, the JCPOA, which the Europeans have managed just about to keep on life support. I wouldn't say to keep alive, but to keep on life support, following the decision of President Trump to withdraw preemptively from that agreement at the early stage of his mandate back in 2017 now, 18. He will, I think, reaffirm the US commitment to NATO. I can come back to that, but obviously, NATO is in itself going through some debates about its relevance, its meaning in a changing world. But I think the doubt which President Trump cast on the Article 5 co-belligerency commitment of NATO will be set aside by President Biden. And we can once again have a reassurance that the US is seriously engaged in NATO. And we can hope, though I'm a bit less optimistic about what that might give, that he will re-engage in the WTO, both on the immediate dispute, which we have to resolve fairly quickly, over the appointment of a director general, which is really a pressing issue, but also on the issue of the appellate body, and then more generally on a reform of the World Trade Organization to make it fit for purpose in the 21st century, which I think all of us can agree is not necessarily the case at the moment. So all of that's the good news, and I think it is good news. The slightly less good news, or the sort of bémol, as we would say in French, is that this election may have represented a relatively comprehensive defeat for President Trump as a personality, as a character. His policies did not necessarily get completely rejected. In fact, the Republican Party, who have espoused his policies, even if they were not necessarily in line with traditional Republican policies, had a relatively good election. They won back some seats in the House of Representatives, and they did not suffer the defeat in the Senate that people thought they might, given the idea of a sort of blue wave of the Democrats. Everything is still to play for in Georgia in January. We really are going down to the wire on this election, where there are exceptionally 2 seats in play, because one was a special election in midterm and is being replayed as part of these elections, and the other was the normal 6-year election of a senator. That's going to be replayed in January, and it's literally 50-48. If the Democrats were by any chance to win both seats, it would be a tied Senate, and then the casting vote would be with the Vice President, Kamala Harris, therefore a Democrat. So that would give future President Biden a majority in both houses. I think most people, it'd be interested to see what Leslie has to say, but I think most people think it's a bit of a stretch to imagine that the Democrats will win both seats, but it's very closely tied. The more likely outcome is that the Republicans therefore retain control of the Senate, and that's going to give President Biden a lot of headaches in the management of his agenda, as we know, because the extremely partisan nature of American politics means that basically it's trench warfare on almost every issue. Even the appointment of his cabinet would probably then become extremely contentious. And he will struggle to impose his agenda on Congress. This will mean, in any event, whether he, whatever the outcome in Georgia, I think we need to expect that this is a president whose main focus will be domestic. His first priority is obviously the pandemic, which has hit the United States particularly hard. And also economic recovery. So I think that's going to be his main priority, is to demonstrate that he is addressing the issues which are of immediate concern to Americans. And I think the one thing that we can take from this election, as from the previous election, is that there are structural changes in the American body politic which are not linked directly to the personality of President Trump or anybody else. They are about a fatigue in the American body politic with the endless wars of Iraq and Afghanistan, even if many of them were the result of American choices rather than anybody else, with a sense of the inequity of the economic system following from the financial crisis of 2008, and a general sense that somehow America is spending too much time looking after the rest of the world and not enough time focusing on itself. And President Biden is going to have to deal with this. I mean, he may have been elected on a generally optimistic and forward-looking agenda, but this is the reality that he's going to have to deal with. He also has to deal with a not totally united Democratic Party. I mean, they united around his candidacy. They're delighted that they've won, but we know that there are divisions within the Democrats between the progressives and the more traditionals. And this is probably going to emerge as President Biden tries to set his agenda. So I think we need to be very well aware of this as Europeans, as we engage with this new administration, even if it heralds, as we've already seen, the return of people that we're familiar with, Tony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, all of these people that we know to be on the generally internationalist side of US politics. And I think, before I get to the sort of issue of Europe, the main thing I think is that in the end, economic issues are going to be for the forefront. And I think even foreign policy is going to be seen through the prism of what it delivers for the American middle class, as they like to use that term, being Irish and British. We all remember that was the week that was, and the lower class and the middle class, the upper class, John Cleese joke. It has slightly different meaning in the US. It basically means working people, people who are engaged in industry or employment, who are not living off their wealth. This is an important constituency in the United States who feel left behind, and President Biden is going to have to demonstrate that whatever policy he's doing, whether it's domestic policy or whether it's foreign policy, is delivering for them. And I think this is going to play into his attitudes towards China, his attitudes towards trade. And this is something we have to recognize. Now, On the European side, I think we've got off to a relatively good start with the attempt by the Commission and the High Representative, Josep Borrell, which will hopefully be approved in some form or other by the European Council this week, to submit an agenda to this new administration for a renewal of the transatlantic partnership. The original Commission High Representative paper is for me a little too sort of pro-European agenda. We're kind of saying, this is our agenda, wouldn't you like to join us? Which is normally what the Americans do to us. Fine, but it's a good start because it does hit some high notes. I think that will be important. It hits the issue of global issues, the pandemic, the economic recovery, climate change, the Green Deal, the tech agenda, which will be important, China, which I think will be very important for this administration, and the issue of values, democracy, the idea of an alliance of democratic states, even if we can question as Europeans whether all our member states quite meet that criterion these days, but that's another issue. I think it's a good start that we have taken a proactive approach to approach this administration with an agenda. We need to be under no illusion that they will not just say, what a great idea, you Europeans, we sign up to everything, it's all perfect. I think we are a little naive in imagining that we can rebuild the transatlantic relationship for the 21st century without taking a little bit of pain on our side. What do I mean by that? Well, I think there are some difficult issues for us there. The security defense issue, the burden sharing issue is a very important one. Clearly, we do not do enough for our own security and defense. This is a recurring theme of American administrations. We can argue that we do a lot with development assistance, humanitarian aid, and this is true. I think we are entitled to broaden that discussion about burden sharing, but at the end of the day, our security and defense architecture in Europe is not enough that we could defend ourselves if we needed to, and we need to invest more in that. I would argue that we should do that through European cooperation rather than through purely national investment, but that's a discussion we have to have. We have some difficult issues on trade. We know that we need to find solutions to some of these. We've got Airbus, Boeing. We've got some of the difficulties about agriculture. There are limits to what we can do, but we need to find some accommodation to address the prevailing US view that somehow the Europeans are unfair or treating the US unfairly. I don't think this is objectively justified by the facts, but we need to address that. We have tech issues which are going to be difficult, the digital tax agenda, the regulation of the tech platforms will not be a simple issue to address, even if the Americans themselves, I think, have some doubts about the big tech giants and their role in our economy and our society. And so these are the kind of difficult issues that I think we're going to have to address. We have China, on which we share certain views, but I think at the end of the day, we are not completely aligned on how to deal with China. And if we're going to align, are we going to align more on the US side or more on the European side? More on the confrontation, the kind of clash of civilizations view, or are we going to align more on the European view? Well, we have differences with China, but we also need to co-opt China into some of the international issues such as climate change or the Iran deal, where we need China as a partner as well as a rival. So I think this is an opportunity to renew the transatlantic alliance, but we should not be naive on the European side to imagine that we are now going back to where we were 20 or 30 years ago. America has changed. We are facing a fundamentally changed global situation. And part of that equation involves the Europeans being more able to stand on their own 2 feet. I don't know if it's strategic autonomy, but it certainly is a greater degree of self-reliance to be a more equal partner in this relationship than we have been in the past, while still recognizing that this relationship is absolutely fundamental to Europe's values, to our security, and to our economic prosperity in the coming years. So that's what I'd like to say by way of introduction, George. Thank you.
Thank you, David, very much. Great sweeping commentary, I think. And I'm sure that many of you will be starting to think about questions they may want to ask. And so we're going to have a questions and answers session part 1, which will be after we've had Leslie speak. Okay, so on the chat, just type in your questions and I'll take them one by one so that we can have a good debate as well. And can I now please call upon Leslie to speak, and to thank David, of course, very much, and to call Leslie to speak on the same subject, please. US elections, how has the international liberal order been saved? Over to you, Leslie. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. It's an honor and a pleasure to speak with all of you, and it's especially an honor to speak following Ambassador David O'Sullivan, whose work I have followed in his role as EU ambassador to the United States. I always feel like I should also raise the question of Ireland when it comes to an American speaking next to an Irish diplomat, since we are forever fond, and as an American based in the UK, we are forever puzzled by what it is that might be happening as Britain Brexits, and the question of the Irish border is raised. A very important thing for the United States as well, as you know. The question that you've asked is very broad. And it is the sort of, it's the big one, I think, for so many of us. And it's the question that I think was at the heart of every single panel from the time that President Donald Trump was elected until the COVID pandemic. And it, at that point, receded, and the words liberal order were replaced by COVID and pandemic. And so I think it's a sign perhaps that we can now begin to look forward despite the really grave tragedy that's taking place right now across Europe, across the world, and especially in the United States. Nonetheless, we have some hint of optimism, both with the news of the vaccines and with the news of the election. I think the election is transformative. The election of Joe Biden, despite the fact that only 27 Republicans in the US House of Representatives and Senate have publicly acknowledged the result. Many more have acknowledged it privately. The President of the United States has not acknowledged it, despite the fact that enough states have now certified the result that it is firm. And Donald Trump has lost the popular vote, which is not the meaningful one in institutional terms, but it's a meaningful one in terms of legitimacy. He's lost that vote by around 7 million. So it's quite extraordinary in the context of an election where more Americans, as a percentage of those eligible to vote, turned out than at any point in the last 100 years. So the really wonderful part of Donald Trump's presidency is that it really energized the American electorate. And we've seen that across the entire 4 years. Civil society has been deeply mobilized and active on any number of dimensions, whether it's on the streets through what's been very largely documented to be peaceful protests. And I mean, right from the start, from the Women's March, all the way through the Black Lives Matter protests of the summer. Whether it's through organizations like the American Civil Liberties Union, battling out any number of dimensions from the Muslim ban on forward through the courts across the United States. Whether it's been environmental activist groups pushing back against deregulation that's gone, sort of under the radar of many of the headlines. Paris got the headlines, but as we know, the big push that Donald Trump had against climate was at the level of regulatory power. So the good news story, even of the Trump presidency, is that people in the United States, and I think across Europe as well, have become very politically active, more so than they otherwise would have been. And the very good news is that this is palpable and documented at the level of the next generation. Young voters have turned out in the 2020 presidential elections at very high numbers, and they turned out early. And there are some remarkable stories about what the lengths that they went to ensure that their votes would be counted. We've heard the really tough stories about the post office and the attempt to suppress the vote, but people weren't having it. So I think that's a very good sign of the good news that we sometimes don't say as much about, but we know it's there. In the context of what's been a really, I would say, devastating, destructive, and challenging period for the US. So let me walk back and just say a couple of things about the liberal order, and then come back to perhaps what went wrong and whether the election of Joe Biden will lead to a restoration of the liberal international order, or whether we are looking at a different period. And I tend to think that we're looking at a little bit of both, some restoration, but clearly a very challenging period. When I think of, what is the liberal order that we're also committed to saving, I think about a couple of things. One is the commitment to global economic coordination as a mechanism for making sure that when things get really very dark and very bad, that basic levels of exchange remain open and stable and viable, so that they don't create the kind of politics that can lead to the wrong people coming to power. And that's sort of, the lessons of, that's the Charles Kindleberger thesis, right? That's the lessons of the Great Depression, 1929 and the 1930s. And that was really the lesson that I think, led to the creation of the Bretton Woods frameworks and any number of other smaller regional economic organizations that were in part based on that belief in the validity and the legitimacy and the necessity of economic coordination to make the liberal order work. The second thing that I think about is, deterrence and multilateral deterrence and collective security. As again, a lesson for what the world needs to do to protect stability, peace and stability, but really in both of these big lessons to provide a safe space for democracy. And if you haven't read it, I very much urge you to read John Eikenberry's most recent book, A World Safe for Democracy, which is a wonderful theoretical but also empirical book that really takes us through, I think, the history of the liberal order and investigates many of the challenges that have arisen. So when I think about, the big debate that we had for so long about whether, Trump was cause or effect, and I think many people on panels and in journals and speaking had kind of settled on the argument that Donald Trump was a symptom of the changes and the problems in the liberal international order. As Ambassador O'Sullivan said, the fact that it had begun to fail to deliver for the middle class in many of our societies was clearly something that led to a challenge from within. And in the United States, certainly laid the foundation for the culture wars for any number of leaders to manipulate a dissatisfaction and target it towards immigrants, those not born in the United States, as being a cause of the general woes of the middle class. But I think the other context, that confirms the idea that perhaps Donald Trump was, a symptom of broader changes is just the fact that for 14 years, the broader context of World Safe for Democracy clearly wasn't being realized because democracy had been in decline. And I recall in the months of the 2016 election, giving a lot of talks about the shrinking of the space for civil society and civic engagement in Egypt and Russia and Turkey, and the human rights community being tremendously distressed by this all around the world. And there was a little bit of looking inside the United States by that set of actors, but most of it was aimed at a very specific set of questions having to do with the global war on terror and the domestic side of that, whether it was the torture memos or some of the restrictions that were placed on Americans to execute the global war on terror. But there wasn't really a general look at democracy inside of Europe and inside of the United States. But all around us, the sort of hope and premise at some level of the liberal order, which was that it would not only protect democracy internally, but that it would expand not only the case, but the reality of democracy far beyond the transatlantic space, had already begun to not be realized by that point. So Donald Trump emerges, and really he's sort of taking, in some senses, he's taking both of those problems on. He's, of course, much more fixated on the fact that America had invested in this liberal order and that it hadn't delivered for middle Americans, it hadn't delivered for the working class, and that it had delivered, but it delivered not only for people and countries outside of the United States, but for the wrong kind, right? It hadn't delivered for democracies, it had delivered for China. And so I think in that sense, yeah, and he had plenty of empirical information to draw on to make the case very effectively. And he had 2008 revealing what had been already a very long trajectory of stagnant middle class wages, and a set of reforms that didn't fully address those. So plenty to go on to make the kind of challenges that he did, that succeeded for a minority of the U.S. electorate that voted him into office. But I guess I would also say, and I think this is for me the really important point, which is that Donald Trump, and it sort of takes us to the question about where we're going under a Biden administration after January 20th. Donald Trump, in my view, is, yes, clearly a symptom of the overreach, the attempted overreach of the liberal order, the failure to protect democracy and to protect the middle class within its democracies, the failure to realize the dream of extending it. But he was also very much a cause, and he's had a very real and very profound effect on the quality of democracy in the United States. And this, I guess, is where I get very frustrated with a lot of the arguments that want to put him down to simply being a symptom. And I guess a couple of things here I think are really important, and it's important to wind back the clock and imagine, had the election gone the other way, had Hillary Clinton emerged as the president of the United States of America, where would we be today? Now that's a really difficult counterfactual to imagine. But you can imagine a few places where, the United States wouldn't be and where Europe wouldn't be. And one is the tariff wars, and one is the United States coming out of any number of multilateral agreements. And impossible to predict, but quite possibly we might not actually be in the position that we're in with respect to the pandemic. Given the mechanisms that the Obama administration have put in place, not least people on the ground in China, cooperating with the Chinese to guard against just this kind of outbreak and ensure that it didn't cross borders should it emerge. So I think Donald Trump has not only radically altered the context of the liberal order beyond America's borders, but he's certainly, and this goes to what David O'Sullivan said about the context of democracy in America. He certainly altered the context of the Republican Party and what it stands for. And I think there's a very significant question about where we go from here in the Republican Party. And he's he's taken a level of division that existed, or that there was fodder for. He's taken an opportunity in the United States electorate on any number of dimensions. And he's injected a very nasty politics into it, and he's mobilized it, and he's given it a language and a style of politics that didn't exist prior to his presidency. I don't think it's there forever, but I think that he has radically altered the context of US politics, which possibly means that a new president President Biden, who will have a huge amount of work to do to change that. But it does mean that agency matters, that the presidency matters, that the people that are appointed around the president matter, and that the prospect for considerable change is very, very real. So a couple of things. First, on the very concrete point that David O'Sullivan raised about Georgia. Will the Biden team restore the liberal order? They're certainly going to try, and I agree completely that foreign policy will be derivative of domestic policy. Foreign policy will be seen in light of whether it can create the conditions, especially economically, for Americans to realize real gains that are distributed much more equally across the electorate in terms of income and wealth and across racial minorities in particular. Part of the ability to do that depends on whether or not there is a divided government, and that comes down to Georgia on January 5th, for sure. I think it's impossible to predict what happens there because so much of what happened in Georgia in the presidential elections had less to do with what we know of Georgia, and again, much more to do with the agency of people like Stacey Abrams, who registered voters, who inspired them to vote. The Democrats are working that state. Donald Trump is working that state. I think we simply can't predict, although one is inclined to think that both seats won't go to the Democrats. But the other thing I would say about, whether this goal can be realized, whether democracy can be rehabilitated through governance, which depends on Congress, also depends on what happens in the Republican Party. And I don't think that this is purely about who controls the Senate and how, what the balance is in the House. I think a lot of that will come down to what happens to the Republican Party when Donald Trump is no longer visibly hovering and in the White House. And does the Republican Party begin to divide amongst itself? Does it remain united behind the Trump agenda, or do we see a lot more return of moderate Republicans giving voice to what has probably always been their sentiment when it comes to internationalism? And that need for a restoration and a rehabilitation domestically, which is felt by many Americans who identify with the Republican Party, does that have an impact on how Republicans in the Senate behave, and especially whether they work with the Democrats to realize that domestic agenda? So I'm actually much more hopeful, regardless of what happens in Georgia, over the medium term, that we will see a return to an investment in democracy that makes it possible for the United States to engage globally on, and I won't go through, because I know I'm coming to the end of my time, but I won't go through the number of multilateral frameworks that are so critical, but I will end by saying one thing about China. I think what we're going to see, of course, in America's foreign policy is a huge focus on China, on competing with China, on working with Europe and the world's democracies, and especially with Australia and Japan and South Korea and India, partly through the Quad, partly through the Summit of Democracies. Unfortunately, probably not through CPTPP, although I think that remains a question. But I think we are going to see that investment, and it is going to be a lot of what we're going to see happen domestically in terms of getting measures through Congress, spending measures to invest in infrastructure and education and health and jobs. A lot of it will be justified as a mechanism for ensuring that America can restore its democracy and its competitiveness so that it can compete with China. And I think all those things will go a long distance towards ensuring that America remains in the game and works with Europe on restoring a different kind of liberal order, but a very important one nonetheless. Thank you.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Leslie, and very impressive, I may say. I have a lot of questions coming in, of course, but I was just wondering, perhaps very briefly, if David has anything he wishes to comment on what Leslie said before we kick off.
No, I agree with that analysis. I mean, I think America is going through a period of, deep political change. And as Leslie has said, how that plays out, I mean, who kind of wins in that battle is not something that we can directly influence as Europeans. It's an American discussion. They have to sort out, you know, who they feel they are and what their place in the world is. I think it is deeply divided society. I think this is a problem. One of the challenges for Biden will be, can he protect his Democratic base and still sort of reach out and be a kind of healing president to try to bring people together, notwithstanding the deep divisions that are there. And that's the thing that worries me. It's not, you know, the sort of details of the transatlantic relationship or anything else. It's how does America, you know, where does America kind of end up in a few years from now? 2024 is only 4 years away, and will be, you know, this is. I mean, President Biden or future President Biden said this election was for the soul of America. Well, yes, it was in part, but I think the answer is slightly inconclusive, and only 2024 will tell us, you know, who has won the battle for the soul of America, and the pendulum could swing back the other way. And I think, just to be clear, that one of the things, those of us on the outside who attach huge importance to the relationship with America, we have to figure out how we can not be unhelpful in that. I'm not going to say how we can help, because that maybe is too overestimate our influence, but how we can not do things that are unhelpful to the moderate agenda winning out in the US. And I think that's something we have to be conscious of.
Thank you very much indeed. Okay, so first question I have is perhaps very briefly from myself. So President Biden is coming in. Can he restore to the same degree as was the case before the moral authority of the United States in the world, given what's happened? And I ask Leslie perhaps to reflect upon that, please. The moral authority.
Yeah, it's a really, well, I guess what I would say is two-part. First of all, America's moral authority has always been deeply problematic on a global level. It might have felt like a lot of moral authority if you were sitting in London, or perhaps sitting in Germany, or sitting in Tokyo. I don't think it always felt like a lot of moral authority if you were sitting in certain parts of Latin America, or in certain parts of Africa, or perhaps in Iraq, or lots of places in the world. So, you know, what's our baseline for talking about America as a moral authority? It's really very contingent. Nonetheless, I am a very big believer in the idea that words and aspirations, and formally articulated words and aspirations, matter a huge amount, because of course they give voice and they give resource to certain kinds of movements over others, not only leaders, but those within societies around the world. So America's really, really undercut. Even if its moral authority wasn't perhaps what we thought it was, or what we'd like to think it was, it's been undercut dramatically. Can it restore it? Yes, absolutely, a huge amount of it. It can bring it back up to the baseline and perhaps even stretch far above, in part by having the kind of humility that I think actually Joe Biden has in spades, not least because of his personal history and personal circumstances. He's a very, very empathetic person, probably the most empathetic president that America will have had maybe ever. And so I think that the humility of his own personal humility, the humility that attaches to the last 4 years necessarily, and the fact that America will be on the back foot and be seeking to reach out and build partnerships that I think will be genuine, I think will go quite a long ways to helping to restore America's moral authority. But it was always dubious for many people.
Yes, indeed. If one remembers such horrors as Vietnam, I suppose. I have a question here about China. Of course, the US relation to China, of course, it's having a lot of knock-on effects. And I have somebody who's asking, Adrian actually is asking about freedom and despotism and what's happening in the South China Sea. And what can Biden do to forestall China aggression, and in so doing contribute to refurbishing the viability of liberalism there and around the world? And I asked David maybe if he could tackle that. What can Biden do to forestall China aggression and so contribute to refurbishing viability of liberalism there in South China Sea, for instance, and around the world? Do you think?
I mean, I think China is a conundrum for us all. Chris Patten, whom you will all remember as a former EU commissioner, but previously the last Governor General of Hong Kong, used to say the only thing that should scare us more than a successful China would be an unsuccessful China. And I think the dilemma for the West is how to deal with a China which is clearly asserting itself, which is emerging into the global space in ways which are uncomfortable for us. But on the other hand, I don't think that a new Cold War, a new confrontation, a decoupling with China is going to work. Honestly, I think China can decouple from the West more quickly than we can decouple from China. So we have to figure out how to manage this tension. There are many things we disagree about with China, economically, trade-wise, human rights-wise, as the questioner rightly points out, in the behavior in the region. On the other hand, China is too big, too powerful just to be ignored or to be, treated as a pariah and say, right, we don't deal with you. So that is the issue of the 21st century for the West. How do we find a way forward that pushes back on the things that we deeply disagree about, but at the same time engages with China in a way that does not isolate them and deprive them of any stake in the international community? We're talking about multilateralism. China needs to feel it has a stake in that it's able to influence events and not just be the passive recipient of diktats from the West. On the other hand, we're not going to let them dictate events, right? So I think the Trump approach has been completely cack-handed. It's been confrontational. It has almost played into China's hands. Look at the results on the trade. The deficit's actually gone up. I mean, and he has not impacted on the systemic issues that we need to address, whether that's excessive involvement of state-owned enterprises, the compulsory acquisition of technology, or even the technology rivalry with Huawei and ZTE and others. This has not worked. We need a different strategy. And I hope that with the Biden administration, the Europeans, the Japanese, the Koreans, and others, we can sit down and figure out a more intelligent strategy for coping with the negative sides of China, but at the same time engaging so we do not completely isolate this hugely important actor in the 21st century in a way that turns them into an adversary with hugely negative consequences.
Thank you, David. I'll stay with you a minute because I have another question from Sun Yang Qian, which is, now we've got, now Biden yesterday, apparently, according to media reports, has said he's going to concentrate on the EU, one of his things will be to concentrate on the US-EU relationship. Where's UK figuring in all this? And of course, you're addressing a UK audience primarily, so there's a smile on your face, but what happens to the UK, do you think? And frankly, looking at it from a sort of analytical perspective?
Well, look, I mean, I think the idea that Biden is somehow anti-British is rubbish. I mean, he will value the relationship with the UK. The UK has a special relationship with the United States, not quite as special as many British people would like to believe, but they do have a close relationship. They have a historic relationship. They have a security relationship, military cooperation, intelligence cooperation, the Five Eyes. So all of that is not going to go away. Having said that, and forgive me, I have to say this, the UK's withdrawal from the European Union diminishes the usefulness of that relationship in the eyes of the United States, because the UK as a part of the European Union was even more useful because it was a bridge to the European Union. It was a way to communicate into the European Union. Now they're going to have to build another bridge, and the bridge is going to be Germany, it's clear. And Germany will arguably become the kind of go-to partner in Europe, and the UK will still be important, but the UK's general influence and ability to be useful to the US will be diminished. So that's how I see it. I also think Leslie was kind enough to mention the Irish dimension. I mean, if the UK screws up the Northern Ireland issue in the context of Brexit, that's going to make life even more difficult. Now, I've just seen that Boris Johnson is flying to Brussels in the next few days to try and sort out something with Ursula von der Leyen. Let's hope that we can do a deal. Let's hope that we can get rid of the internal market bill, the finance bill. It won't be a perfect deal. It'll be a thin deal, but at least it will, give us a less damaging exit on the 1st of January than would otherwise be the case. I hope that is the case, and then we will be in a better place. If by any chance we end up in no deal with all the consequences of that, then I think there will be even greater tension between Washington and London than would otherwise be the case.
Okay, well, let's all hope for the best. Now I'm going to combine two questions for Leslie on social media, really, and big tech. So from Jay Marshall, can liberal democracies survive big tech? In fact, can any political ideology survive big tech? And roll that in with Hannah's question on QAnon. What's happening with these conspiracy theories that are going on? Where are they coming from? And can we put this kind of thing back in its box? And if not, how does a democracy deal with people like that? Tough questions. Leslie, please.
Those are really tough questions.
So sorry.
and for O'Sullivan only got China. No, those are really good questions. So big tech. I mean, I do think that this is obviously technology, and the scale of the actors in the United States is going to be very much at issue in the next 4 years, and people expect the tech sector to face a lot of challenges in the government. But I think maybe the question is sort of asking for, what do we do about disinformation, about tech, who's going to regulate the technology sector? These are all questions that I think there are a lot of people that understand and have been beginning to grapple with this. And there's a huge knowledge gap, right, between the people who are actually in the sector and the people who are talking about trying to regulate the sector. And we saw that when we saw some of the hearings in Congress between Facebook and the committees, where just the gap in knowledge is quite considerable. So I think one solution is closing the knowledge gap, and there is a rapid development on that dimension. But I guess technology is going to, the regulation of tech is also going to come into the global question, right? Because some of what's at stake isn't just at stake domestically for the United States or in the transatlantic partnership, but it's also a question of what values are going to be infused into our technology. Are they going to be neoliberal democratic values? Are they going to be a set of values which are more, social democratic, or in which the state plays more of a regulatory role, but it's in order to ensure the free marketplace of ideas? Remember, the free marketplace of ideas has always had institutions behind it that make it function. And our mistake was to think that, in fact, the free marketplace of ideas meant that there was no state and that tech should just do it at once. But the issue is coming up globally, clearly, because what we also don't want is, the surveillance state, which is the wrong way to go when it comes to state intervention and control of the tech sector. And so I think what we're going to see is an internal conversation within the United States, a transatlantic conversation. And then we're going to see, and if you listen to Tony Blinken, the next Secretary of State, assuming that confirmation goes through, he talks a lot about this, right? The competition between techno-democracies and techno-authoritarians as being one of the biggest ones out there going forward. And the concern is that a lot of China's, export of its surveillance technology, regardless of its intentions, is going to states and it's tipping the balance in that balance of power between the state and civil society. So, you've got the big questions on the table. QAnon, it's just horrifying, and I am not quite sure where we're going with that. But I think that Biden and his team will take this on in a pretty big way, and probably, not in the first 100 days, but certainly in the first 18 months.
Thank you very much indeed. And I have another question fancy that. To what degree is the sustainable survival of the international liberal order dependent on reforming our own democracies? For instance, in the United States, you have the popular vote. In fact, the popular vote meant that Hillary Clinton won last time, but of course you have the electoral votes, the electoral college votes that came up with a different result. Here in the UK, similar situation in the sense that we always have people with minority votes who form majority governments. To what degree is this frustrating people, do you think, and to what degree we need to somehow, and how can it be tackled? Because of course we have the political parties who are in power don't want to change the system because it works for them. So an enormous question once again. Leslie, you look as if you want to tackle it, perhaps, and then I'll ask David afterwards, or do you want a little bit of a break and I'll ask David first? What do you prefer?
Oh, absolutely. Ask David first.
David, I'm so sorry. May I ask you that question about our democracies and how to reform them? And surely that's one of the keys to liberal democracy winning at the end of the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie, for what we call in football a hospital pass. Look, of course, I on one level, I agree. The mechanics of democracy are important. Whether you have unicameral or bicameral systems, what is the electoral system? Is it proportional representation? Is it first past the post? Is it a list system? Is it a constituency system? I mean, the answer is all of these things potentially can work. And I don't think there is a single model that you can impose. You can say to everyone, you have to have this model, and if it isn't that, it's not democracy. And I think that's the difficulty of the situation. I think people have to feel intrinsically, is their system democratic? I mean, you know, the system we have in Ireland, you know, the most complicated proportional representation system in the world, which, by the way, we were gifted by the UK while we were still a part of the UK. We're now deeply attached to it, right? We think it's the most democratic system in the world. I'm not sure. I think the first past the post has visible deficiencies, namely, you know, by definition, the government never has a majority of the popular vote. In the US, the popular vote versus the electoral college, but be careful. How do we organize ourselves in Europe as a sort of confederal system? We weight votes according to population and countries, because we are, you know, it was important that states did not feel they would be outvoted by the most populous states. So you have 7 states in the US who elect 2 senators and only 1 member of Congress, right? Now you can say that's a huge anomaly, or you can say, well, that's a way of binding together a country that is very diverse and very different. So I don't disagree with the thesis that the mechanics of the electoral process are important, but I think we need to be careful that we should not get obsessed in thinking that there's one model that is, you know, perfect, and then you have to have that, and if you don't have that, it's not democratic. I think a bit like Winston Churchill said about a white elephant, difficult to describe, but you know it when you see it. You know if your system is democratic or if it's not. And I think in the UK, the first past the post system definitely is a constraint on the expression of the democratic will. For the British people ultimately decide how you deal with that. But I think we need to be careful in imagining that there's only one form of democracy that is perfect. And countries ultimately need to remain free to make their own choices about how their democratic system is organized.
Thank you very much, Leslie. We're coming to the end now. If you want to tackle this one,
yeah,
the pass is over to you.
I think I'm very much aligned with Ambassador O'Sullivan. Let me add to what he's already said. One thing is, I think we sometimes fixate on the institutions that are incredibly important. We know, for example, that I think the statistic is 30% of the American people elect 70% of the Senate, right? We know that these are problems, but part of why we are very fixated on it now is because the country is so polarized. So I would say some things are easier to tackle. I mean, none of this is easy to tackle, but if we really, really need to tackle the polarization question, right? We used to have a middle of the road where you would have fiscally conservative Republicans, but they were socially liberal, and the other side of the Democrats. We don't have that. We don't have that middle anymore. People, their values, if you take 21 values, they line up along partisan lines, right? The electorate is polarized, the leaders are polarized. So democracy is going to work better if we give people reasons to mix up that polarization, and that happens in part through investment in education and part through investment in people's economic opportunities, jobs, and employment. So I think that's my starting point. And if we can solve those problems, which are much more fundamental, the institutions will still be important, but they'll be less important because the differences will be less profound in the ways that they are. But I guess my other, and this is very unpopular, but it does seem like it's a little bit sympathetic with what I think with how I read David O'Sullivan. I grew up in Omaha, Nebraska, and so it's a very large state with a very small number of people. I was in Omaha. But so I'm sympathetic to the argument that you actually don't want to be dominated by the coasts, that there is a reason why the American institutions are the way that they are, why you have, 2 senators for every single state, regardless of the population. And I think that basic value that's been institutionalized from the beginning in the United States is incredibly important. It's just that, it's gotten a bit extreme because of the way that we've developed. But we don't want to lose it. We wouldn't want to go the opposite way. So again, it's incredibly complex, but there is a reason for protecting the autonomy and independence of different parts of the United States.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And that comes to the end of part 1. But please stay on if you can. I know that David O'Sullivan may have to leave us at some particular point, and I therefore wish to thank you enormously for your great contribution. And of course, this is going to be recorded, so many other people will benefit from your wisdom and from Leslie's wisdom for that matter. And so I'm now going to move on, if I may. And please, some of the questions, by the way, that you've asked in the chat, we may well ask them of Hans van Baarle. I welcome Hans van Baarle to come in. Hans is an old friend of the liberal order because he is part and parcel of the liberal order. If you could just switch off your microphone, please, Ahmed. So he is the current president of the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats in Europe, as well as the past president of Liberal International. And I think no better person than to give the riposte to say what is the international liberalism's response to the challenges facing us in the world. And now, if I may, I move over to Hans, if we can get him. Thank you.
I'm here.
Hi.
Can you hear
me? Very well.
Thank you very much, George. For the first instance, I would like to say that the Brits matter. The Liberal Democrats overseas, the British group of Liberal International, the Liberal Democrats at large are of vital importance to the Liberal family. Brexit or no Brexit. So it's great to be in your webinar here. I would like to make some comments on the United States, on Liberal International, and also on the European liberals, and see how we can work together, because this is, I think, vital. If you look at the United States, of course, who am I to question David O'Sullivan or Leslie Vinyamura? I mean, they are the experts. But from abroad, I would like to say the following. I hope that Joe Biden becomes indeed a president for all Americans. That means that he has to distance himself to a certain extent from what we could see as the left of the Democratic Party. Let us say people like Bernie Sanders. He has to move to the center, which is difficult because then it needs two to tango. So moderate Republicans must accept Joe Biden also as their president and must work with him. And that will be a challenge. Interesting enough is that both Liberal International and also the ALDE party, so the European Liberal Democrats, have a good rapport with the International Republican Institute, which felt ashamed that Trump conquered the Republican Party. So I think we should reach out also to those Republicans. We should, of course, reach out to the National Democratic Institute for International Relations of the US Democrats. We have had a good relationship with them, but we need more than that. I mean, it is very strange that both Liberal International and the European Liberal Democrats are able to even call heads of states in Asia or prime ministers or in Africa or in Europe, but we are not able easily to call lawmakers in the United States. No, sorry, you can come in later. Sorry?
It's all right. I think there's an unexpected interruption, but carry on, please.
No problem. So what we need to do is also to secure that our friends in the United States, so the US Democrats, are open for direct dialogue. I mean, John Kerry, who will deal with climate, is a very important person. Our president of Liberal International, Hakima El-Hayteh, was very instrumental in the Paris Agreement on climate. So I hope that they will be able to connect directly. The same with people of the House of Representatives and the Senate. We need, as liberals, to be able to have direct contacts, phone contacts, other contacts with our like-mindeds, which is vital. Then we have, as liberal community, a lot to offer. I said we have a very good, let me say, connection in Asia. Don't forget that we talked about China, but in Taiwan we have, and this is a real democracy, an inclusive democracy, we have a direct access to the Democratic Progressive Party, which is president of Taiwan, Mrs. Tsai, with the foreign minister, but also with legislators. So we can offer a lot. We have good contacts in Hong Kong, and we even have contacts in the People's Republic of China, but then with dissidents, people who don't play a role in society of the Communist Party, but we have connections. The same is, we have this in Africa and in Latin America. If we will turn to Europe, Liberal Democrats are not tiny and not insignificant. Maybe just to remind you that the chairman, the president of the European Council, Charles Michel, is a Liberal Democrat. There are 6 Liberal Democrat prime ministers, including Michael Martin of Fianna Fáil of the Irish Republic and many others. We have President Macron, who is joining us. So in the European Council, we are rather strong. If you look at the European Commission, we have 6 commissioners. One of them is Margrethe Vestager, who is one of the executive vice presidents, important personality. We have many others in the commission. We have Thierry Breton, who is of La République En Marche, the French, but he joins us. If you look at the European Parliament, we're the number 3 party, and we're strong in the European Parliament. So we have a lot to offer to the world, and especially also to the United States. So therefore, I think we should, what I said again, be of service, be there. We have the Frederick Naumann Foundation, which is a German foundation of the Liberal Democrats there, which is all over the world active. We have our European foundation called ELF, our think tank. So what we should do as a Liberal family to be there and to help moderate Republicans, to help our friends, the US Democrats, and we should have open access. Then to return to Europe, there is a strange inclination in the European Union that is that we have to be an honest broker. I would say no, we have to be clear on our interests, our values, and then to take sides. For instance, if you look at China, and also David O'Sullivan referred to China, I'm less optimistic than he is. I mean, China is a dictatorship, and a very strong one, a tough one. Look what happens to the Uyghurs. They're in concentration camps. Look what happened to Hong Kong. Look what happens to, let me say, the Tibetans. Look to what happens to minorities as such, but also to the civil society in China. So, yes, we can work to a certain extent with China, but we don't share values with them at all. If we look at Russia, Putin's Russia, the same applies. I mean, also we have in Russia friends, courageous friends, but it's not Putin. It's not his Russia. So if you look at the international relations, there is only one superpower, one major country, and that's the United States, where we share values. And of course, we can have problems with the United States on issues, of course. But in the end, if we don't come together, the United States and the Europeans, the European Union especially, we cannot fight COVID dictatorship. We cannot fight illiberal forces. And we should then choose sides. And I think, again, we have a lot to offer. We can do a lot together. And I'm looking forward, both from the side of Liberal International, and Robert Woodrow Brown would agree with me, this organization has a lot to offer. And also the other organizations, such as the European Liberal Democrats, have a lot to offer. So we want to work together with the United States, with Joe Biden, with Kamala Harris, as much as possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hans, for a comprehensive overview. I have a question that's come in, but first I want to ask I want to have the privilege to ask the first question, which is a purely factual question, and that is to do with Liberal International. Why is the US Democrat Party not a member of Liberal International? That is my question.
Well, I think that they don't want to be part of an international family. The same is also with the Republicans. They're also not officially part of another international family. So the major American parties, the two parties, are self-centered, self-oriented, and American-oriented, unfortunately. I mean, Liberal International would, of course, love to have US Democrats in their ranks, but they've never wanted to do this, not under Obama, but also not under other presidents of a democratic nature, also not under Clinton. And also Madeleine Albright, who I see as a very important personality. She is of high age, but she is a vital person, has never wanted to join Liberal International, unfortunately. But then we have to, again, to go to them, to help them, and to include them as much as possible.
Yes, I think that's good. And perhaps with President Biden coming in, it's an opportunity to try again. And just to let you know, of course, that we do have members in the United States who are on the line today, including the chair of our North American branch, who will be very happy on the spot, to deal day to day with trying to sort things out for you. So this is an offer from Lib Dems overseas. Now, and in fact, thank you. And then one of the questions we have is, in fact, from one of them, from Nazreen in New York. And she asks, with the rise of populism worldwide, how can international liberalism provide a strong and appealing alternative vision?
The most important thing is that we offer solutions. And that we don't call, let me say, people who don't share our vision deplorables. No, we have to look for solutions, whether it's in the United States, whether it's in my own country, the Netherlands. Because what I see also in the Netherlands, which is an old established democracy, there are a lot of people who don't feel represented. They can be immigrants, but also there can be people who have been for centuries citizens of the Netherlands and who don't feel part of society. And also us as Liberal Democrats, we have forgotten them and we should include them. So it's no time to be politically correct. It's to look for solutions. And therefore, we as politicians are elected. So this is what we should do, finding solutions and working together, because it's good that we have this webinar. But we have so many liberals in the world who don't know of each other's existence and don't connect and don't talk to each other. And there, Liberal International can play a role as a kind of mediator, but also ALDE can do so.
So I'm looking for more questions for Hans. At the moment, I have a question that from Caroline, who's one of our members, and she's based in London for the time being, and Carl, her husband. Where does international liberalism sit on the US spectrum? Is Joe Biden a true liberal, or just the closest we can get?
Well, we have so many shades of liberalism. But the most important thing is that we are all the liberals are for civil liberties, for equality. We don't distinguish people from their color of their skin or their sexual orientation or their religious orientation. We look at the individual. That's vital. So I think Joe Biden comes very, very close. Absolutely. So again, if I would be a U.S. citizen, a U.S. voter, I would not doubt for a second, and I would have voted for Biden, of course.
Yes, we have a question saying, are we too nice? Are we just sitting on the center? Are we prepared to do more than just sit in the center?
Liberals should be feared and not be liked. I mean, politics is a kind of rugby, and we have to be tough. And I see this in the European environment. I see this in the European Parliament, that we like to be liked, but sometimes you have to be tough. You have to say, well, if you don't do it our way, we won't support you. And also Liberal Democrats are always looking for a compromise or a broker role, a role of honest broker. But sometimes you should say, no, we won't support you. So we have to be tough. Again, we can't just redo history. But I'm really a fan of the Liberal Democrats of the United Kingdom. But at sometimes when they were in government with the Tories, they could have been tougher.
Do we have any more questions for Hans? Leslie, do you want to, if I can rope you in back again, do you want to ask any questions of Hans, or do you want to comment on what Hans has said about liberalism worldwide, in your opinion, if I may ask?
I am a little bit, I guess I would love to hear more about what Hans believes about the future of the transatlantic partnership, and specifically about the US-UK relationship. I'm very, very curious.
Thank you, Leslie. Well, I see for us Europeans now, members of the European Union, absolutely no alternative to this transatlantic, I call it community, because it's not only defense or security, it's also trade, it's also civil liberties, because in the end we are close. So what I would like to see is not that Europe will say, well, we will do our defense on our own, because I don't think that the EU in the end will send troops abroad. Not really. I mean, we can adopt resolutions, we can keep the peace when the peace is there, we can be of help, but we need to work strongly with the United States. and be on military missions together with the United States. If you look at trade, there is a difficult issue because indeed also the US Democrats are not the real free trade party. And we have to get the United States back. They are in the World Trade Organization, but really to be active. We have to have the United States really to be back in the World Health Organization with all the problems this organization has. But without the United States, it will not work. So I think that what we as Liberal Democrats all over the world should do is try to be as influential as possible in the United States to get them back to a more multinational approach, which is not easy, but things are never easy. But I believe that the transatlantic community is the vital point of departure for this.
Right, I'm going to carry on asking questions until the very end, but still welcome to have others come in with questions. I noticed I've been involved in Liberal International for 2 or 3 years now, and there's some parts of the world in which it's barren ground, like for instance South Asia. There's no sign of life for liberalism in South Asia. Difficult to find any kind of liberal-leaning party there. Curiously, also Australia, New Zealand. Yep. There's a lack. There seems to be gaps in a lot of places. And also, I point to the fact that, of course, we are strong in Europe, as you rightly said, because we have a number of prime ministers, leaders, commissioners, and so on, but somehow not so strong outside Europe. What can we do about that, Hans?
Well, this is indeed a big issue. If you talked about Asia, and George, you know Asia quite well. We have a vice president of the Philippines who is, of course, not the tetra-minded. The tetra-minded. There are liberals in the Philippines. They're not yet having the presidency, but they had previously. So this is a big party. If we look at Thailand, we have the Democratic Party, and you can question a lot of decisions they have made, but they're the best we have. So we have to connect to them. So I told you about Taiwan. So indeed, there are liberal forces in Asia, and we should work with them as well as we can. Barren ground is partly also Latin America, where we have a lot of think tanks. We have some parties in government, and we can strengthen that. But the most important thing is, I think, is to include more the liberals of Canada, because strangely enough, they're part of the world family, the liberal world family, but they don't engage. And Trudeau is the best we have got in Canada, but he is unable to play a role in the liberal family. We have invited him many times, but we should do it again. We should do it again. And what I told you about the United States, we should not just wait until the US Democrats knock on our door. We should knock on their door. But it's true. If we look at Africa, Africa has become a more significant continent for the Liberal Democrats. We have problems there, but we have also promising leaders in government and ministers. And again, this connection of the liberals in Asia, in Africa, in the Americas, in Europe is vital. Then what you told about New Zealand and Australia, there is not a liberal party. Some parties maybe are called liberal, but also there we have to knock on the door. We have to go there. In COVID times, that's difficult, but we should do it. Again, we should not wait for people to ask us, but we should go there to ask people to join us first, maybe as observers or invited guests. There's a lot of things we can do and we should do, but not to sit idly by.
don't think you ever sit idly by, Hans. Any other questions? Yes. Somebody has asked the question, and my computer is going a bit wonky at the moment, as you may see. In terms of liberal values, should we support the EU to also impose sanctions on China, or will Biden's administration reverse this approach and back to engagement policies?
Well, as I discussed with you earlier, we can to a certain extent work with China, but again, China should also respect us. That means that if they go on suppressing their own people and other people, there should be sanctions, targeted sanctions, and best together with the United States. And again, there is no free press over there. So there are a lot of people say China is the best partner for climate policy. Well, I don't believe so. So we have to be tough on China, but David O'Sullivan is right. It's not a tiny country. So we have to do it together with an enlightened United States. But certain sanctions can be applied and should be applied.
Super. Well, thank you very much indeed. And I think I'm going to tie things up. I think that we've had a fascinating set of 3 speakers, and I thank you all. David, who's left us, Leslie as well, Hans, because we've had both perspectives, the sort of the practitioner diplomat in David, we've had the academic approach, but from a US citizen in Leslie, and then we've had Hans to give the liberal response. So thank you for that. I think obviously, you know, we are all thankful that Joe Biden has got in. I think he is going to make his mark, but I fear so much that so much China, if you pardon the China coming back, the Chinese porcelain, let's just say, has been broken with Donald Trump. It may take his term, his one term, as he says, a one-term president, to try and even put things back to where they were before, such as the mess and such as, of course, the ravages of COVID-19. So my worry is, of course, whether this 4-year term is a call for us to say, okay, Europe, okay, UK, you've got 4 years more chance to put your house in order so you can stand on your own feet, because it's not at all clear how the US will go after those 4 years. We hope for the best. But of course, we have seen when it comes to Obama and George W. Bush, the swings between different ideologies have become more and more extreme between the Republicans and the Democrats in terms of, you think, oh, Obama, it's a blessing, my God, what a change that's been. And then suddenly you get Trump, swing towards Trump. Then Biden, which is at least a more moderate swing. But with these kind of swings back and forth becoming more and more extreme, we just don't know where you're going to end up. So I just hope that all our politicians will not sit back and say, okay, we're back to normal. No, you've got one more chance, maybe 4 years, to sort things out for the sake of international liberalism, maintaining and expanding the benefits of what it can bring to the prosperity of the individual across the world. So I want to thank you all for joining us. And I'm going to now hand over to Adrian for the last few words. So this is George Cunningham from Lib Dems Overseas, wishing you all the very best and handing over to Adrian. Thank you so much.
Thank you, George, and thank you for chairing an excellent session. Thank you to Hans, Leslie, and David beforehand. I hope you all enjoyed the evening's debate, and I'm sure we will all meet up again soon, hopefully in person, but we should certainly have new LIBG forums for next year. So I look forward to arranging them and look forward to seeing you all again in due course. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you. See you soon.
Thanks, Hans. Thanks, Leslie.